amphibians. Why are we going to talk to you about amphibians today? Because there are lots of them. Amphibians are extremely speciose. There are more than 8,000 species of them. Sure, there's more species of birds, but you know that there are more species of amphibians than mammals. And there are lots of species of reptiles, but there are more frogs than there are snakes or lizards. There are frogs everywhere. They are all over the place in the terrestrial environments. Just to give you a short introduction to amphibians in general, they come in 3 flavors. There are the caecilians, which nobody knows really a whole lot about, the salamanders and newts, which have tails, and frogs and toads, which don't. The largest amphibian in the world is the Chinese giant salamander, which can be up nearly 2 meters long. And I say this, you know, to the whale people, this is a huge animal, and they laugh because the smallest whale is, you know, much bigger than this. But in relative terms, this is a big salamander. But the smallest amphibian is one of these little frogs, these little leaf litter frogs from New Guinea. A big one is 8 millimeters long, and that's an adult. So you can imagine what the little ones look like. They are very, very tiny. This is a caecilian. This one is from Mexico. Caecilians are mostly blind. Most of them are blind. Most of them do not have any tails. They do not have any limbs, and they're entirely fossorial. They live underground. And so they're very, very poorly studied, very, very poorly known. But just about everything you can think about them turns out to be strange. They have poison glands on the tail, and it should be. They have sensory glands on their snouts, and they work their way through life by smelling their environment using a chemosensory tentacle that sticks out above their upper jaw. Nothing else has anything like it. I don't think anything else really needs it. Salamanders are found throughout the northern hemisphere and into Central and South America. They also can be extraordinarily abundant. This is a fire salamander from Europe. This is a rescue newt from the West Coast. This salamander is from California. And this one, with these fluffy gills, is an adult. It's found in a lake in Mexico. They never turn into adult form. They stay permanent larvae all the time, which is fairly common among a number of salamanders. Frogs are in incredible abundance. There are over 7,000 different species of frogs, and they go from looking like normal frogs to looking like they're really weird. This one, the Suriname toad, lays its eggs on the mother's back, and the skin grows around them as they incubate. And when they're done, out pop little frogs from her back, which is a strange thing. Some are very pretty. These ones are both brightly colored and highly poisonous. Eat one and you won't live to regret it. These are toads, and they look like dirt. They're also poisonous. If you eat one of these, you probably will learn to regret it. Frogs can jump, and their whole anatomy is based around propelling themselves with their hind legs. They have a very elongated pelvis, which sets the articulation of the limbs right at the back end. So the body acts like is essentially a bullet. And this is the propulsion system back here. They push back with their limbs, propel themselves, and got very long limbs so they can extend that propulsion phase as long as they can, and off they go. They close their eyes when they jump, so they can't really see where they're going, but they manage to figure it out anyway. Most frogs transform from tadpoles into frogs during their lifetime. There's a little frog, not yet a frog, but not anymore quite a tadpole. At this stage in their lives, they're highly vulnerable. This little animal can't eat because its mouth parts are changing from tadpole mouth parts to adult mouth parts, which are entirely different. It can't, it's got 4 legs so it can jump, but the tail gets in the way. It uses its tail to swim, but then its legs get in the way. The skin is changing, its tail is changing, its tongue is changing, its eyelids are changing, everything is changing. So this is a very vulnerable stage in their life history. They can't live this way, and so it proceeds very rapidly. In a day, this animal will be a frog, its tail will be gone, and it will be hopping around like a frog. As I said, with some salamanders, they don't transform. They stay as adults, as larvae, all through adulthood. Some tiger salamanders can choose which one to be. They may transform or they may not transform. And often these two morphs are found in the same population, so it's facultative. But there are other amphibians that forget about tadpoles and larvae altogether and go through the entire development within the egg or within the womb and hatch out or given birth to as tiny little adult forms. This is a mama Sicilian from Africa with her babies. Some of these Sicilians gestate their larvae in the oviducts. They hatch in the oviducts and they graze on the uterine lining. And when they hatch out, and they graze on the mother's skin on her back. So there's a great deal of parental care in these animals, mother looks after them. These ones are fun because here's a mother marsupial frog and her offspring. To lay their eggs, the male stuffs the fertilized eggs into a pouch on her back, where they go all the way through development and come out of the pouch. You can see the open pouch here as the frog. So they have no tadpoles. Frogs eat with their tongues. And they swallow with their eyeballs because their eyes are so big that when they close them, they fill up their mouth cavities and push the food back. Okay? Don't try this at home. And they sing. Amphibians are incredibly noisy animals. And so, being so abundant, they're quite noticeable when they're absent because the air should be filled with frog calls in the spring. I'll play some for you. Here's a peeper. And here's an American toad. And there's a bullfrog. That's what spring sounds like. They have these big vocal sacs which act as amplifiers. They are impedance coupling devices that match the sounds made in their vocal cords with the air that surrounds them, so they are transmitted with maximum efficiency, and they can call. The frogs are, without doubt, the most abundant of all terrestrial vertebrates. These are European common frogs. They're busy mating. If you think about this, this is one section of one pond where these frogs are mating. There are hundreds of these frogs in these places, and each pair of them lays thousands of eggs. A female bullfrog can lay 20,000 eggs in one go. Even a small toad, about 2 centimeters long, can lay 3,000–4,000 eggs. So you have a mess of frogs laying even a bigger mess of eggs, and they all turn into a whole lot of tadpoles, which will transform into enormous numbers of little frogs. So they are hugely abundant. And if you don't think that makes impact upon environments, then you haven't listened to Jess yet. So here's Jess.
Oh, thanks, David. So yeah, amphibians are super diverse. They live just about anywhere, like David showed you, and they interact with lots of areas in their environment through their different life stages. They can be on land, they can be in the water as tadpoles, and they're really important in these ecosystems. There's lots of things that amphibians do that make them so important. This is a figure from the Amphibian Survival Alliance. It talks about how they're important to medicine and culture and food in some cases as pest control because they eat a lot of insects and the tadpoles even eat mosquito larvae. Indicators of environmental change. We often say this is because they are so sensitive, but they're actually not all that sensitive. So when amphibians are in trouble, we should really be worried. Their importance in all sorts of different aspects of science like ecology, but we're going to talk today about how important they are to the environment and how important these amphibians are for maintaining healthy ecosystems. To do so, I'm going to tell you an example about the Fowler's toad, our beloved toad in the lab, and their tadpoles. So the adult toads live on land, they interact with a terrestrial environment, but the tadpoles act quite differently. Thousands of them live in ponds where they interact with aquatic environments that surround them. I do a lot of outreach talks with kids, and kids always ask me three main questions about these tadpoles. They ask, where do they live? And that's easy enough, I can tell them. They live in water, most any water. Tadpoles can live in little ponds, they can live in puddles on the side of the road. Some species live in little pockets of water in plants. They can live all over the place. Ours live in ponds. They ask, what do they eat? And I can tell them, well, they don't eat pizza and donuts and apples, but they probably eat algae. This question's a little more complicated though, because they can eat some other things too. And the last thing kids ask me is, what do they do? How do they interact with this environment around them? And adults ask me this too, but they tend to phrase it differently. They say, why are they important, or why should I care? And the answer to this question of what these tadpoles do in their ecosystem is a more complicated one that we don't really know the full answer to yet. So that's where I come in, and that's what I study. I study how these tadpoles interact with their environment and how they affect them using these big mesocosms that you can see here. These mesocosms mimic their natural ponds, and in some of them I have toad tadpoles, and in some I don't. So I can see how these ecosystems change when the tadpoles are there or not. There's lots of things in these mesocosms I can measure, things like nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, algal communities like phytoplankton and periphyton, and even little zooplankton communities. I can gather all of these different samples from all these different communities, bring them back to the lab, and see how they change. And they do change. They change things a lot. So these two mesocosms here, you can see, were established at the same time. They have the same sand substrate, they have the same amount of nutrients, they have the same amount of sunlight. The only difference is this one, it says no tadpoles under it, it's nice and green, doesn't have tadpoles, and it never has. And the one next to it has 100 Fowler's toad tadpoles in it. So we can see this huge difference in algal biomass between these two ponds. The picture next to it is a satellite photo of two natural ponds, and we can see this pattern again. We drive around at night in Long Point when we're doing our field work. We're always listening for the toads, so we know where they're breeding, and we can track them where they've laid their eggs. So we know that this lower pond has thousands of little American toad tadpoles in it, and the toads decided it didn't like the upper pond that year, didn't breed in it, made this nice little natural experiment for us, and we can see that same visual difference in algal biomass. The one above is much more green. Now this matters to the biodiversity within the pond. Different communities can grow in these different conditions. They create different structural conditions. It also means some ponds will have a species of tadpoles and some won't. But the bigger difference this makes is across a landscape. So each of these ponds that have tadpoles and don't foster these different communities. That means that across a landscape, some ponds with tadpoles will have one kind, some ponds without tadpoles will have a different kind. And that creates a huge amount of habitat heterogeneity, so different types of habitats that different creatures can use across a landscape, which is helpful for biodiversity on the whole. So that means that these little tadpoles that are often overlooked, they're just one life stage from one kind of amphibian, are hugely important for maintaining a healthy environment. So as a whole, amphibians are clearly very important for maintaining these healthy ecosystems. So if they're so important and we need them so much, what's happening and where are they going? And to answer that question, we're going to go back to David.
Thank you, Jess. So we're racing ahead. I could talk more slowly. Problem is that amphibians, as many people now know, are becoming increasingly scarce. It often seems as though the most important thing about amphibians is that there are progressively fewer of them, but I hope you believe that's true. But amphibians are recognized as being threatened throughout the globe. This is from the IUCN, their red list of threatened species, and they list that fully 34% of amphibians around the world are threatened with extinction, and another 6% are near threat. Well, this is a lot, and this is more dire than other kinds of vertebrates. Amphibians are much worse off than fishes or birds or reptiles or mammals, based on over 4,000 population time series and nearly 1,000 species. What's the population trend in percent per year? Amphibians overall are negative. And other animals, vertebrates, are not so badly off. There are more extinctions of amphibians than other kinds of vertebrates. Here's amphibians, and it's happened more recently and at a greater rate than reptiles, birds, mammals, or fishes. And overall, among all animals and plants, according to the IUCN, the organisms that are the worst off, except only the cycads, are amphibians. So this is really worrisome. It really bothers me because I work on amphibians. Now, the thought that amphibians are declining was first broached and studied with care by scientists a little over 30 years ago. And for the most part, people have been looking into things that can cause the deaths of amphibians. Contaminants or destruction of habitats, climate change, invasive species, emerging diseases have all been looked at, well, generally one at a time. Does this kill the frogs? Does that kill the frogs? People have been searching for some kind of dreadful magic bullet that has devastated frogs. For the most part, it's gone from, one cause to another. Oh, no, it's this. Oh, no, it's that. No, it's this, without a really holistic view of things necessary. I'm going to tell you two stories, though. And actually, these are good news stories. They're about two frogs, one frog and a toad, to illustrate that it's not quite so simple as you might think. This is Ranicieri, the Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frog. And it prefers to live in high mountain lakes in the Sierra Nevada where there are no fish. It's important that there are no fish because the tadpoles are vulnerable to predation. They have lived in these places for thousands of years, and they're not adapted to deal with fish predators. Now, my relationship to this species is only peripheral. In the 1980s, when I was a postdoc in California, which is going back a long time, I went looking for these frogs up in the Sierras, and I went to the places where they were supposed to be, in these high mountain lakes. I looked for them there, and I've had a very difficult time finding them. They were not as abundant as they used to be. I had records to go on and museum specimens to go on to tell me where to go. No frogs. I eventually found some yellow-legged frogs in some small streams, not in the lakes at all. And small streams are not recognized generally as places where this species ordinarily should live. So something was wrong. That observation and others by other herpetologists around the world went into changing people's minds about amphibians and realizing that they were in trouble in a great many places. Now, the reason why the frogs were in trouble in these high mountains lakes was because they were no longer fishlets. The old style of wildlife management was to provide hunters with deer and ducks and fishermen with trout. And if the lake didn't have fish in it, well, it should. And so the policy of California Fish and Wildlife for years and years in the mid of the last century was to load up planes with small fish, larval fish, and dump them into the lakes. You didn't even have to go visit. You'd drop them from airplanes, and those have survived. In order to provide recreation for anglers and their dogs and their families and spend a pleasant weekend in the Sierras catching fish. The result of this is that the frogs suffered. The fish and frogs are not compatible. Where there's fish, where there's the trout, there are no frogs. It's only where there are no trout that you still get frogs. It's very clear that this was what was going on. There's something else that happened. So the frogs were pushed out of the lakes where they preferred to be, and they moved into suboptimal habitats nearby, into small streams. And they crowded into these places, trying to get away from the fish that would eat them, and they became susceptible to disease, which killed them off even more. This is the usual story with diseases. Diseases, epidemic diseases, almost always hit when the population is already compromised, when it's already stressed and immunodeficient. Then disease has an easy time killing them off. So there's a double whammy on these frogs. Before the trout were introduced, this is a kind of ecosystem that just told you about. There are lots of terrestrial and aquatic invertebrates, which are eaten by the froglets and the frogs, lots of algae eaten by the tadpoles. There's garter snakes that ate whatever they could. And trout ate the tadpoles, trout ate the food that the frogs ate, trout eat everything. The result, no more frogs. But more lately, in last decade, wildlife managers got twigged onto this and realized about time that not every lake has to have trout in. You can have some lakes that don't. And so this is a result of a study of 3 lakes in the Sierra Nevada were treated with fish poison, roadknot, to get rid of all the fish. And as soon as you get rid of all the fish, these are the stars here, where the fish were eradicated. And in each of these lakes, the frogs recovered, shot back. No fish, no frogs, no disease. That's a success. So bad news for yellow-legged frogs is there's trout, and if there's disease. But where did this come from? What's the ultimate cause of the trout being there to begin with? Well, California Fish and Wildlife. Clearly, Fish and Wildlife departments are bad for frogs. But where did they get this idea? Well, from people, just from fishermen. So obviously, in order to keep the frogs happy, you should get rid of all the fishermen. But I don't think that's going to happen. So we do need to keep this in mind, where the problems come from. So good news for yellow-legged frogs is no trout. The other story is to go back to Fowler's toads, which we just introduced to you. Look at the adults and their abundances. This is the landscape at Long Point. This is a picture that just took in 2017. Here's Lake Erie. Lake Erie on a mild, calm day. Lake Erie is not always a calm, mild lake. It can kick up its heels and create a lot of damage because it's really big. And during the summer, the toads live on the beaches here and stay in the dunes during the nighttime. In spring, they migrate over the back of the dunes and try to find themselves someplace to breed back here. Although for a long time, there was no place to breed back there because it was all filled with an invasive reed. So this is their environment. And they hibernate in the dunes as well. There are only 3 places in Canada where the toads live. They live on the Niagara shore, they live at Long Point, and they live at Rondo. And we looked at Long Point. So after studying these for a really long time, starting way back in the late 80s, we began censusing these animals for entirely different reasons. But in the early 90s, people became concerned about how the abundances of amphibians and reptiles. And so we had data and we followed it along. Initially, they went up in abundance, and they went down, and they went up, and they went down, and they went up. But right about here, there's a change. And it just slid down and down and down. And this change we found to be associated with these reeds that filled in the marshes. Right around that point, the reeds had succeeded in filling in all of the places where the Fowler's toads would normally breed. And so, just like the yellow-legged frogs squeezed out of their lakes by fish, the Fowler's toads were squeezed out of their breeding sites in the marshes by plants. And they tried to breed in inappropriate places like beach pools that would get washed away, or in parking lots that might have been flooded, and that's where we find them. So these are the reeds, and this is what they did. Here is a site in 1991 where the toads are singing quite happily. This is the same scene in 2005. I took both pictures standing in the same place, looking in the same direction at the same time of year. And it's just entirely different. The reeds have taken over and they can't breathe there. So what should we do? We argued with the Canadian Wildlife Service and with the Ministry of Natural Resources in Ontario, and we suggested that maybe we should provide some breeding places. So here's some semi-natural ponds that were dug into the marshes by Canadian Wildlife Service in the area at Long Point. Former student of mine, Catherine Yankee, used these for her experiments. Those are her floating pens filled with tadpoles. So they're very nice ponds. The toads didn't like them at all. They didn't use them. They're too surrounded by reeds. They were too deep and too cold. And the frogs really didn't, toads didn't think much of them, which was unfortunate. I just stepped in and rescued the tadpoles that were being laid in parking lots and beach pools and raised them up. So we had a program parallel to Jess's research work to capture and rear and head start toads and musicosms, and then go with little toadlets. So that's another thing. And finally, the federal and provincial wildlife agencies decided that they would go into the marshes and mash the frag. They would get one of these marsh master machines, take it into the marshes, roll it over, poison it, burn it, and smash it to bits. So this is the marsh from the air. There's this tree you can barely see. That's before, and this is after when you mash the frag down to bits. Okay, so we're trying, see what we can do. Did it work? Well, here's the trace of I showed you before with the ups and downs of collared toad males, and we can extend that on a few years. These are the years where we put in the ponds that I showed you. Here's where the CWS and Ducks Unlimited went in and mashed the frag. And here's where we did rescue and head starting. And did this work? Well, not really, no. It didn't work. The toads didn't really respond. But there's something else going on. Well, something else is the lake. It's a big lake. And this lake is subject to changes in water level. And these changes in water levels are not really controllable because the lake is so big. Here's a high water mark in the mid 80s, and another high water mark in the mid 90s. And we noticed 11 years apart, after a lag time of a few years, the toads had risen in abundance. In recent years, there was another high water mark. The lake flooded the shore. Would this happen again? It's 3 times, really means there's something. What do you think? Did it go up? It did. It works. The reason why is that the high water levels lead to washouts of the dunes. This doesn't happen all the time. The cottage owners along the shoreline try to harden their coasts and beaches so it doesn't happen. But where the shore is unprotected, then the lake can do its job. This is aerial photos. Here's a pair of our ponds right here in 2018. This is all phragmites. This is all reeds. And here a few years later, you can see just barely where those ponds were. As of this year, this is entirely obliterated. You can't see them at all. But the sand has been pushed in. The dunes here have been flattened. Sand is pushed in, and all along the edge of those sand flats, you can see that there's shallow water sand that the toads love. This is from this past spring, and this is from 1989. And you can see that it's very, very similar. Toads would sing in this spot. And we found this spring toads singing there all over the place. So here's the landscape at Long Point now, with after these washouts, very, very different from what it was before. The frag has been smothered by sand. And toads were singing there this spring. We found lots and lots of tadpoles, and all those tadpoles turned into tiny little pumpkins. So in this scenario, it's not really what we did in our mitigation efforts. It's allowing the lake to do what it does anyway, because these animals need that change. If you try to stabilize this environment, the frogs won't respond to it because they need these periodic changes in their environment. It's not that we need to restore the environment or keep it as it is. We need to keep this regime of disturbance as it is, so that it's continually being disturbed as it should be in nature. It's a different way of thinking. So here's our toad, and as Jeff showed you, there are lots of influences on what these animals are subject to. And we tend to think of in this way that all of these things, diseases and competition, contaminants and predation and invasive species all around, are all impinging upon this animal and affecting it, generally negatively. And we need to figure out which one of these it is. But it's this diagram, which you can see reproduced in a number of publications, isn't actually true, because the animals can deal with that normally. They can deal with predation, they can deal with diseases, they can deal with competition at normal levels. But when these are all in excess of normal levels, that's when they're in trouble. And they don't all work, as we see, all the time or independently. They interact with each other. And in the case of the toad, well, there is an invasive species, the Phragmites reed, in excess, too much of the stuff, which led to excessive habitat change. The change was that the habitat no longer changed. And that affected the toads negatively. One thing after another. In the case of the yellow-legged frog, a bit more complicated. There's another excessive invasive species, fish, which resulted in excessive predation, which affected the frogs. That's the first thing. But it also meant there was habitat change, which led to disease coming in, which was the double whammy that hit them again. So there's cascades of effects that we can try to dissect and consider. So there's a frog in the room. What we tend to do then is think of these animals, endangered animals in general. We focus in on the animal, but it's not the animal's problem. It's a different kind of problem. So we can look at the animal, and we can spend all our time looking at the animal. Maybe we'll pay attention to the environment in which it lives and come to better conclusions. But, there's a gorilla in the room. This is the gorilla. Who's the gorilla? Well, it's people. These people. Or maybe it's these people. Or maybe it's this guy in front. Or maybe it's just me. Sure. So we are part of this whole system. We can't be divorced. Conservation biology is the interaction of people with animals. So what I wanted to tell you is that we are now living in what people have termed the Anthropocene. We are building buildings, controlling the surface of the earth to a greater extent than any other species ever. But amphibians have to adapt to this. Either they adapt to it or they don't. And they can adapt to it. Maybe not exactly like this, but they can adapt to it because amphibians have been around for a very long time. And they will live long after we are not here anymore. In the future, way off in the future, You know what will happen to all of this structures? They will crumble and fall, and we have a geological stratum of rubble. A time when cell phones are useless and credit cards no longer work. But in the far off future, even amidst all this rubble, there will be life. There will be new species. And there will always be cockroaches. And there will be toads to eat them. So thanks for listening.